Hi, this is Zach with Worn&Wound. Today we'll be taking a look at the Longines Heritage 1973 chronograph. This is a brand new chronograph from Longines that is a tribute to a watch that they released in 1973 called the Conquest, which was very, very similar looking. There are a few differences we'll go over later, but otherwise was this kind of very of the period chronograph, panda dial, with this very cool cushion case design. What's also interesting about this cushion case design is that it's really not associated with Longines. It's associated with the Heuer Camaros, which were unveiled in 1968. It's a very cool line of watches from Heuer. Part of, they made all these wonderful sport chronographs, and the cushion case one is actually a little bit dressier. It's an interesting watch if you see it in person because it has definitely a more formal feeling to it than the Carreras, than the Ottavias. But now Longines, they used the same case in 1973. They originally were powered by one of their in-house movements, and for this reimagination of the watch, they blew up the case a little bit to 40 millimeters, and they put in a very cool movement in it, the Longines L688, which is based on the ETA 7750, but has been remade for Longines as a column wheel automatic chronograph. Now this watch comes in at $3,250, which is by no means inexpensive, but it is oddly within the watch marketplace, basically the entry level column wheel Swiss made automatic chronograph. So it's a mouthful to say, but it has a very cool movement in it, and certainly the execution of this watch is really excellent. So let's take a closer look. The cushion case of the Heritage 1973 is definitely one of the stars of the show. I mean, the dial definitely goes a long way too, but there's something very distinctive about this case design that obviously speaks to the watches that we mentioned in the intro, but just, it's a little unusual, and it's quite beautiful when you see it in person. The finishing on it, the beveled edges, the mix of polish and brushing comes together to be a very elegant design. And like I said, they actually made this larger than the original watch, which was 37 millimeters, and this is 40 millimeters in diameter, 47.6 millimeters lug to lug, and then 14.4 millimeters tall. So it's actually quite tall. I don't know what the thickness of the original watches were, but they definitely added a lot onto the back to get a rotor in there. And then, they also go up to this nice boxed sapphire crystal, which speaks to the acrylic crystals that would have been on, watches from the 70s, but is a sapphire, which is a nice, modern execution for that. At 40 millimeters, though, I have to say, I think this is a really just wonderful size for a sport watch. It is modern feeling, but it looks vintage, but it doesn't feel like a weird kind of in-between thing between the two of those. It works just very well. And the finishing on this watch is exceptional. I think Longines within the bracket of Swatch brands is kind of a step below Omega, but it's above Tissot and Hamilton. I think you can see that in their executions, and I mean it's a $3,000 watch, so it better be well done. So on this top surface here, you have like a radial brushing that goes out from the center, so it's kind of has a sunburst effect almost. Really, really nice. I love how that throws light around. Then you have this beautiful beveled edge here that rides the edge of that kind of inflated square, giving it that cushion case. Super sharp. Adds a nice little glimmer of light there. Straight lugs coming off, also polished on the top. You have a really nice flat shape here that just looks very cool. On the sides, then you just have a polishing. On this, on the right side of the watch, you have your chrono pushers and a crown that is nicely sized, 6 millimeters wide by about 4 millimeters tall, appropriately sized. It's not screw down, so you can hand wind this watch. On this side, you actually have a little pusher here, which is for advancing the date. Otherwise, it's totally plain. Just very clean, wonderful looking execution all around. And then you flip the watch over, and you do have a display case back here showing off this pretty great looking movement, the L688, which we'll look at in more detail later, but you can clearly see the column wheel there, balance there, and just decoration all around. The dial of the Heritage 1973 just speaks very closely to the designs from that era, from the 60s and 70s, really nailing the little aesthetic details that made those watches so cool. And I mean, let's just start. It's a panda dial. I love panda dials, which is a white background with black subdials. There's something just great looking about them. I own a couple. I think that they're a particularly beautiful example of kind of a mid-century sport design, and they're kind of coming back because I think brands are realizing just how great looking they are. There is a second dial option though, which is a black dial with silver subdials, which I'm sure in person is also quite great looking, though this just happens to really speak to me. So the dial has a main index here of applied markers, or these steel markers with a black line running through them. They run for the hours. There aren't actual hour numbers. Between them you have a sort of checkered flag version of a second and minute index where these individual minutes are longer and they're pushed through, and then there's like a sub-second marker between them, and you have this kind of staggered effect, which is actually pretty busy, but it's nice, and I think it gives it kind of an exotic racing feel to it. On the very outer edge then you have a tachometer. This is actually a dark blue, which looks really nice. It might be a little hard to pick up on the camera because it is quite dark and it's subtle, but just that little hint of color there is really nice, and that is something that you would see on some Carreras and some Camaros back in the 60s and 70s as well, and I'm sure is faithful also to the Longines conquest. Looking in now at the subdials, this is where the design changes the most, though it is kind of a subtle change. The original Conquest had a subdial at 3 and a subdial at 9. This one adds a subdial at 6 for the hour register, though that is totally in line with chronographs from the 70s as well. Ones that use the Valjoux 72 movement would have had a very similar arrangement to this, so it still feels correct for the period. And what they did was kind of interesting. So they kept the subdial at 3 and 9 clearly black, with a circular graining in there, so they have a little bit of a sunburst effect when you move them around in the light, so they really stand out off the dial. And then at 6, the hour index is white and it's flat. It's not recessed into the dial at all. So it's a functional reference, when you're using the chronograph. Obviously an hour's not going to go by, you can use that to time, and I think that's actually critical for functionality. I mean, 30-minute chronograph doesn't really do too much for you if you want to time something, longer than 30 minutes, a walk or, a race or anything like that. So I think it is really good to have the hour register there, and I'm glad they added it. And in doing it like this, the watch, when you see it from a distance, I looked at it on other people's wrists, you really can't see that subdial at all. It really just looks like a two sub-register Panda dial. So I really like how they did that. I think it was a smart addition that also modernizes it and just makes it more functional. Between 4 and 5 is a date window. It's perhaps going to be the most contentious thing on the entire watch. They did kind of force a date window into there. I got used to it very quickly. On this model, at least the white dial, it is a white background date disc, so it isn't overly in your face, but there's a lot going on this dial, so the date just adds to that. It isn't really necessary, and it does feel kind of punched through. Like I said, though, you get used to it quick. On the black dial, maybe not so much if it stands out, unless they flip the color there, but it is what it is. Quickly looking at the hands of the Heritage 1973, the hour and minute hands are these kind of blocky shapes. They mimic the applied indices here. They're silver with a black line running through the middle with some lume towards the end. The lume on the hands actually glows fairly well. It will charge in the sun and go into a dim room, and you will see those hands glowing. There is actually also lume on the outside of each of the markers, and it's kind of like a little half dome. That doesn't charge as well. I feel like the markers themselves might actually be blocking the light a little bit, or they're just not very powerful. If you hold a light directly to it, you will get a charge, but otherwise the lume on the hands is the predominant lume. The sub-registers then have kind of classically styled little stick hands, white on the black dials, black on the white sub-dial here. The hand I like the most is actually just the chronograph second hand. It's this very fat polished steel hand here. I feel like it's much larger than you typically see for a chronograph hand, so it has a lot of presence. It actually it's really quite bold when it's stopped and in the center, almost blocking a little bit the Longines logo. But it's like how massive it is, and just how much visual weight it has on the dial. Apart from the vintage-inspired design of the Heritage 1973, the other real standout feature is the movement. It's this Longines L688.2 automatic column wheel chronograph movement. This is a movement that was developed by ETA exclusively for Longines. Obviously, they're all part of the Swatch group, so they get to do that kind of thing. And I don't know if it's used Sometimes when they say exclusive, like the Tissot has the Powermatic 80, and then Hamilton has basically the exact same thing, but they call it something else, and they say it's exclusive to each. So I don't know if this is truly exclusive to them or not, but it's certainly not in any of the brands below Longines. There could be a version of this up in Omega, perhaps. I think they use this as a base for their coaxials, but it's not confirmed. But either way, it's a very interesting movement. And what's really cool about it is the column wheel mechanism here, which you can see very clearly at the top here. It is a dark blue, so it might be hard to see the details of. But what that does is basically there's two types of chronographs. There's a column wheel chronograph and a cam chronograph. Column wheels are considered to be a higher end version of a chronograph. It's a more precision movement to make. The piece that's in there is more complicated to construct, so it tends to be in more expensive watches. Oddly, though, in the Seagull ST19, it is a column wheel chronograph, so that is the most inexpensive by far chronograph you can get. But those, if you use them, it's a little bit more of a novelty than it is a really high-functioning and well-made piece. So when you start the movement here, the chronograph running, you can actually see that rotate. You can see how various things move around, and you stop it, and it'll move again and reset it. So it's just nice that you can see it there, but obviously it is just a higher end mechanism. And then the movement itself is very nicely decorated. You have perlage on this automatic winding plate here. You have perlage down on the balance cock. You have balance here. You have Côte de Genève on the Longines rotor, as well as gold Longines. The movement itself is also it's a 28,800 beats per hour movement, so it's a nice smooth sweep. 27 joules and a power reserve of 54 hours. Flipping it over now, just showing you again, it works just as you expect. Start it to start the chronograph running, pause it also with that button. The buttons have a wonderful feeling to them. Something that to me really matters with the chronograph is the feeling of the pushers themselves. Often quartz chronographs lack the kind of stiffness of it, and that is something I've found lacked in the Seagull movements too, is a nice crisp feeling from the pushers themselves. And then you can obviously reset it with the button at 4. To adjust the date, you use a toothpick to push this. I mean, you could use something else, but I would just be careful of the case finishing on the side. So you just put that in there, you press it, and the date will jump forward. It's very simple. I don't really know what the advantage is in doing that versus having it in the crown, but it is how it was designed. Otherwise, it is just a totally normal movement in functionality, but very elegant and high-end. The Heritage 1973 wears very nicely on the wrist. I really like the 40 millimeter size. I think it was a good decision, if not a necessary decision, but it was a good decision to up the scale for this reimagining of the watch. I have tried a Heuer Camaro on, and they're really cool watches, but they wear like a vintage watch. They're quite small. And this just has the right amount of presence, the right amount of mass. I think the case design itself, because it's really so centered on the cushion, that the lugs don't feel quite as much like they're part of it. It's not quite like a lugless design. It's more perhaps like a wire lug, where you really feel like the watch is centered here. So the lug to lug, though it's 0.6 millimeters, which is I think totally within a nice boundary, feels even smaller because it just feels like it's sitting here on top of your wrist. Then the watch is just exceptionally beautiful. It's nice and sporty. It definitely has the vintage undertone, but it has a really nice kind of elegance to it as well. The applied markers, the polished steel, the beautiful case design, they all speak to something almost formal. I think it definitely has a nice mass to it to look like a sport watch, but it's very classic, very gentlemanly. I mean, this is absolutely a watch that you can wear, to the office, to formal events. I think it's really, you can do whatever with it, but it's a really just beautiful watch with a nice sporty undertone to it. It comes mounted on a 20 millimeter black gator strap. This is authentic gator. Has a nice kind of creamy off-white stitching along the edge, which makes it a little bit more of a sporty versus a formal gator style strap. I happen to really like gator straps. They've kind of grown on me as of late. They're usually fairly expensive. You're rarely going to find a real gator strap for under $100, so I haven't really picked many up. But when I try them on a watch, even with a sportier watch, they do something nice to it. It just has a nice feel to it. They're very thin, but they're rigid, so you don't have a lot of bulky leather, and it just looks really good with this watch. Like I said, it's a nice mix of elegance and sportiness in a single design. Finishing off, you have a simple thumbnail buckle with a nicely kind of sculpted Longines logo there. Just a really beautiful watch. You can wear with just about anything. I mean, this is kind of a light bluish gray gingham patterned shirt here. I think this works very well. It would also look great with a gray suit. You can do anything with this. To wrap up, I think the Longines Heritage 1973 is a really exceptional watch. It's beautiful, it's well executed, it's extremely well made. The only downside of it is the price, which is going to make it prohibitive for some at $3,250, which, at that point you could, even look for a vintage model with a similar case. But I think they did a really good job of modernizing this and making it a watch that is going to stand apart a little bit from the watches that they are basing it on, or the watch specifically, the Conquest, that they're basing it on. But even if you look at the Camaros too, the enlarged case here, the 40 millimeter case, works really well with this case design. I think might make it actually a little bit more wearable. Like, I really enjoyed the feeling of this case on my wrist and the way it looked and the presence it had. It's very masculine, but also very elegant. It works very well at 40 millimeters. It's also not a case you really see very often. This kind of cushion case, we associate cushion cases perhaps more with dive watches, but this kind where it's bowed but comes to really nice points, something really exceptionally interesting about it. And then this version with the Panda dial is, just to die for. If you're a fan of Panda dials, this one just hits all the right notes. And I also really like that they snuck that third sub-dial in there, adding in the functionality. The date it could have done without, but like I said, I don't think it damages the dial or really hurts it so much that it kind of ruins the watch in any way. It just feels like it doesn't need to be there. It's a little crowding in the area. Same time, it is nice to know the date. The movement also, lastly, the L688 movement, very nice movement, a column wheel chronograph, automatic column wheel chronograph. That's, a really high-end movement in there. That it's great that they're offering it. It does add to the price, but I think it just comes together to make a really exceptional watch. So please read the full review of Worn&Wound. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you.